And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We're talking about the genre of essay writing today with essayist and Marshall University History and Women's Studies professor Laura Michele Diener today. And Laura Michele joins us. She's currently an associate professor of medieval and ancient history at Marshall University. She got her MFA in creative writing in 2016 from Vermont College and her PhD in history from Ohio State University. Her teaching interests include textile and fashion history, Vikings in the Norse world, medieval Britain, and women's religious culture. Her research focuses on textiles, fashion, and women's identity, and her article Sealed with a Stitch, Embroidery and Gift-Giving Among Anglo-Saxon Women has appeared in the journal Medieval Phosphography. She's currently at work on several chapters on fashions and medieval hair for the Volume 2 of the Cultural History of Hair, forthcoming with Bloomsbury Press. She's contributed chapters on medieval monastic women to edited volumes published by Brill and Ashgate Presses. She's also director of the Women's Studies program at Marshall University and regularly teaches the Women's Studies 101 course, and she recently had an essay in Lake Effect, which was profiled as one of the notable Best American Essays in 2015, and we're glad to have Laura Michele Diener with us today. So Laura Michele, welcome to Chapters. It's so good to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for asking me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about essays, but before we get into essays,
Sure.
We were talking a little bit before we started taping today. You actually got your PhD first,
Yes.
and then went back and got your MFA in creative writing.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that process and kind of what made you go back and kind of focus on creative writing as an interest?
Yes. Well, I had completed all the academic publications I needed for tenure, and I was really interested in learning to write in a different way, a way that was maybe a bit more beautiful and lyrical, and that could help me explore some of what I was interested in without some of the constraints of academic writing. And it was actually because of Rachel Peckham, who had been hired at Marshall, that I learned about the genre of creative nonfiction. And she encouraged me to take some classes, and I ended up going back to a low residency program for my MFA. So it took about 5 years to complete, but I enjoyed the process very much.
That's great. So when people talk about creative nonfiction sort of as a subgenre of a major genre, which is nonfiction writing as a creative writer, what does that entail, creative nonfiction? What are some of the types of writing, someone who's interested in that, like yourself or another writer, what are some kinds of works they would be producing sort of in that genre?
Well, they could be producing memoir, certainly. They could be producing essays that aren't intended for a scholarly audience, but rather are exploring, diverse subjects for a popular audience. And they could be exploring, really any kind of nonfiction narrative that's, maybe not intended for, one particular audience or a specialized group of people, or that requires specialized knowledge to understand.
How has your training as a historian and going through the PhD program at Ohio State, do you find that helps you when you're writing creative nonfiction? Is there any overlap? I know it's not as scholarly or academic. The creative nonfiction is maybe something you would do for as a historian, but did those fields kind of blend over, and do the skills that you have to use for historical research carry over into the creative nonfiction?
Absolutely. In fact, I frequently write about the same topics, just in different genres. So I'm very interested in religious women and spiritual culture, and that's what I wrote about for my dissertation. And in that case, I had to have a thesis and I had to back it up with examples, and I did a lot of archival work. Really, it's the same process. I just write in a different style when it's creative nonfiction. I still do a ton of research. It's very source-based. I'm very conscious of primary sources. I also use secondary sources as well. It's just I construct my sentences differently. I'm not so much looking to construct a clear argument, but rather to raise a lot of questions. And one thing that creative nonfiction does is I can take topics that maybe historically don't blend seamlessly together, but they might have some connection in my mind, and I can explore that.
Very good. So there does seem to be a lot of overlap there. That's really interesting. I wanted to ask you about one essay that you wrote that came out in the online edition of Yes Magazine not too long ago. And it's a story about the involvement of a group of Kentucky nuns.
Yes.
And that's the nuns like we think about in Catholic school, and some people might be familiar with if they've been to Catholic school, sort of the traditional Catholic nun. And they campaigned to stop the Bluegrass Pipeline.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about those women, what the Bluegrass Pipeline was, and how did you get interested in really profiling them for an essay?
Oh, well, I got interested in them because of a film called The End of the Line, The True Story of the Bluegrass Pipeline, which is an independent film by Cellis Walder. And OVEC, the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, hosted a screening of it. And I went really to support OVEC because I love what they do. And it turned out that this documentary featured some incredible women who were nuns, and I've had a long time obsession with nuns. So really, once I saw that film, I decided I had to meet these women. But in researching them and what they had done, I realized that actually nuns all over Kentucky, not just Kentucky, but that's where I was focused, really all over the U.S. are just at the forefront of social activism in a number of causes, including environmental activism. So in this particular case, there was a proposed pipeline that was going to cut across people's property and also the property of the Sisters of Loretto. The company was pretty devious. It threatened eminent domain for landowners who didn't want to comply. It also kind of used confusing language. It said, oh, this is natural gas, like what you heat your houses with, which that wasn't it at all. This is natural gas liquids, but the landowners frequently didn't know how to say no. They weren't organized. A lot of them couldn't afford lawyers. And then the Sisters of Loretto they're a teaching order, or at least they were until Vatican II. So they had a long history of research and also educating the public. So not only did they say, no, you cannot put an easement through our land, but they helped organize the community against the pipeline. And in the end, they were successful.
So I did have one question I wanted to ask you, a quote that I found was really interesting, and Sister Scholes talks about this in the essay, and I think this ties into what you were just talking about a moment ago. No Christian can live, and this is what she says, no Christian can live the gospel fully unless they attend the needs of their brothers and sisters, including Mother Earth. She goes on to say, our work for social justice grows out of the Catholic social teaching and the gospel of Jesus Christ, which I think ties into what you were just talking about there, about how they kind of took it upon themselves to lead this charge because it's part of their training and part of their faith to take on these initiatives, not just caring for one another, but caring for Mother Earth as well.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of them find a great deal of spiritual inspiration in the beauty of the earth around them, and they see themselves as custodians of the natural world that they happen to own, so Loretto owns a great deal of property. After the pipeline, after they were able to defeat the pipeline, they looked around and wondered, well, okay, how can we be using this land to even greater purpose. So they've started creating a wildlife preserve, nature preserve on their land as well.
That's really interesting. And something else that came up in that essay that I found was interesting is the women talk a little bit about how fewer women are entering convents and fewer women are going into the nunnery. And there's this idea of what's going to happen to Kentucky's longstanding tradition, as you've been talking about, of sort of religious women who are socially and environmentally engaged. Did you get a sense when talking with them what they see as the future, or if the continued decline in women entering the nunnery continues, who do they feel like is going to kind of carry this forward when the day comes that they're not around or there's nobody to sort of step in and fill their shoes?
Well, even though they are all incredibly realistic about the lack of young women entering any orders in America, they all seem incredibly at peace with it as well. I think certainly at Loretto, they're interested in keeping the land of Loretto in some way protected as an institution, but it doesn't have to necessarily be for nuns. It can be in another capacity. They all seem to be very optimistic about the future.
Very good. It was a fascinating essay, and I would encourage our audience to read that, because it takes sort of two issues that you don't think of as being, common together in terms of nunnery and religious women leading this charge. It was really a fascinating essay. I wanted to ask you about another essay that appeared in Appalachian Heritage called The Body of Water. Tell us a little bit about sort of what's behind that essay and how you got it placed in Appalachian Heritage.
Oh, well, I knew about Appalachian Heritage because someone who had been at Vermont College with me was the editor, and so I was really just starting out in terms of literary publishing, and I had no idea how it worked or what to do or how to find what journals were publishing, except for the ones I knew about because my friends worked for them. And so that's how I found out about that one. I thought, oh, well, I know that exists, so I'll try and submit it to that and see what happens. In terms of what I was thinking, I'm not from West Virginia. I've lived here for about 10 years, and since I've been here, I've been very conscious of the environmental injustices that have been occurring and occur all the time for a variety of reasons in West Virginia. I wrote that shortly after the chemical spill that occurred in Charleston, and the more I learned about it, the more I learned how old the storage unit was that was meant to hold this incredibly dangerous chemical that no one knew about. Then I learned how long it took to inform the public. Just the more I learned about it, the more appalled I was. And I would say that incident really sparked my environmental consciousness specifically for West Virginia.
You had one line in there that I really liked, and you wrote, "Every morning and every evening I walk along the river that divides prosperous states into impoverished ones, and I clearly live on the impoverished side, because how else could I afford waterfront property?" And I really like that line, because I was thinking about the Ohio River, and I was thinking about the Kanawha River in Charleston, and I'm thinking about all those big bodies of water, the Mississippi, and all those famous rivers that we know. And if you think about who is operating on the river, but who's on opposite sides of the river, you do get a lot of that impoverished and impoverished. And I even think about when I go to Cincinnati, visit Cincinnati, and you talk to people that live in Cincinnati, they view people on the other side of the bridge in Kentucky as being sort of different from them, or being Appalachian, despite the fact that northern Kentucky is very affluent and prosperous. But it's amazing how those bodies of water, divide geographically, but also culturally. People look at those people on that side of the river as being a little bit different.
Absolutely.
So I really found that interesting. I really, really liked that line.
Thank you.
We'll get back to a couple more of your essays in just a minute, but I want to ask you a little bit about process. When it comes to writing these essays, when do you get the idea, and do you write as the ideas come, or do you wait for maybe 2 or 3 ideas that you can't sort of shake out of your mind and then write a collection of essays that way? How does the process work for you in terms of putting those together?
Well, I generally write one essay at a time, and usually it's the result of at least a year of keeping a diary. I keep a diary every day, and I just write my observations, and I frequently write down my dreams. And at some point, they all start to coalesce together into an idea for an essay. So I should say I write them one at a time. I frequently, I guess, have a few going on at any given time, but one I'm always more focused on.
Do you you mentioned you keep a diary. Do you write your essays pen and paper, or do you keep your thoughts on pen and paper and then type at the computer? How does that process work for you?
I write everything by hand until it's almost finished, and then I type it into the computer and try and work on it that way when I want to be conscious of things like word count and organization.
Very good. And what's the market like for getting essays published? Are you finding because I know you've submitted some things to online journals, are you finding that online is opening up new opportunities, or is the market kind of like it is with other publishing genres? It just depends on what you're writing and who you're submitting to. How does that process work, and what's the market like for if someone is writing an essay or they want to become an essayist, getting their work out there for an audience?
Well, there seem to be thousands of opportunities, both print journals and online. And I don't think that there's a divide in terms of quality between online and print journals. And so in terms of the market, I think you just have to be willing to send one piece out to, dozens of journals and see what takes.
Very good. So don't be afraid of rejection.
Oh, no, not at all. I have a friend of mine who has published books. He's a very experienced writer, and he keeps a record of all of his rejection letters, and he has hundreds.
Yeah. And I know we've had a lot of writers talk about that. Don't be afraid of that rejection letter, or those 5 rejection letters, or those 10 rejection letters. Keep writing, keep submitting, because you'll find a home for whatever it is that you're working on. So I'm glad to hear that that's the same for essays.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to another essay that you wrote that really touched me. Late Afternoon with Shadows Lengthening, which was more of a memoir, and you talked about memoir at the beginning of our discussion today. But it's about your father, a very personal story about your father, Abraham Morgenstern. Tell us a little bit about him and sort of what some of the themes are that emerge in that essay.
Sure. Well, I should say that's not actually my father's name. My father's name is Alan Diener, but I use that name for the essay. And I'm sorry, I forgot what the second part of the question was.
Tell us some of the themes that you had in that. What was that essay kind of about, and how was it structured?
Well, so that essay was about observing him suffer from mid-stage Alzheimer's. It developed because I was on sabbatical, and so my parents live in Baltimore. I went home to Baltimore more than I normally would and for longer periods of time. And so I probably spent more time with him during that sabbatical than I had since I was in high school and living at home. And so I think the essay was about trying to understand what was going on with him and chronicle it in some ways, and thinking back over our relationship. In some ways, it was trying to figure out who he was at the time of writing, because he clearly wasn't the person I knew or had grown up with.
Can you give us some insight? We hear that term Alzheimer's, and it's one of those words in our vernacular that makes the sort of the hair on people's necks stand up. But when you're in that environment, as you were with your father, what is that like? I mean, what's that like, observing someone that you love, as you mentioned, not be the person that you remember, but watching that decline? I mean, can you give us some insight into what that's what that does to you in watching someone who clearly is not that person, but watching that deterioration? And sometimes it can be quite rapid depending on the person and the severity of the illness.
Well, I would say my father's has been gradual, but it did strike him very early. I think that's what surprised me the most. He was showing signs before he turned 60. And I remember thinking at the time, I'm too young to have a parent that is going through this. I'm watching people a generation above me go through this with their parents. So how am I going through it? I would say that in terms of the process of watching that, it really tests your patience, and it really makes you reconsider what kind of person you are. It's so easy to be impatient with certainly in I don't want to say all people have Alzheimer's, but I only know my father and my grandmother as well. Their behavior can be maddening and extremely difficult. And so I guess it's a trial and also an opportunity to become a better person yourself, because if you can't be kind and patient with a beloved parent, then who are you?
Yeah, that's very true. That's a great point. And I like what you pointed out, just some brief facts in the beginning of your essay. You said, by the time my father started to lose his memory, he began to sort through the household trash on a daily basis. He picked out with surprising care bent hangers, soleless shoes, cracked mirrors, unattached buttons, and other items he deemed worthy of resuscitation. His triumphant scavenging at first irritated my mother, and then you kind of go on to talk about that. So, yeah, we do get a sense in that essay that there is, you're watching someone who, from the outside, who that person is, but you're seeing someone on the inside not the same person that you remember.
Absolutely. I would say there's been several complete personality shifts, not just behavioral shifts, but just attitudes and ways of reacting to people. And so I guess I've been constantly readjusting that relationship and how I react to him.
Yeah, very good. And it was just a very powerful, poignant essay, and
Thank you.
I really, really enjoyed that. So we mentioned at the beginning of our discussion today that you had an essay in the notable Best American Essays in 2015. What was that essay, and how did you get chosen, and what was your reaction to being selected for that honor?
Oh, well, I had nothing to do with being selected. I think certain journals simply put forward certain essays, and I had no idea it had happened until actually a friend of mine congratulated me, and I had no idea what they were talking about. There are a number of people who are chosen each year, and it was the year that I graduated with my MFA, and someone I had graduated with had also, one of her essays had also been chosen, so I was just very pleased about that. What was that essay about? It's really hard to say. So it is about... Well, I guess on an immediate basis, it starts off, I'm in Texas, and I'm looking at a tree on a ranch in rural Texas that reminds me of Odin's Ashtray. So in some ways, it's about Norse gods, but it's also about incidents of violence that occur in Texan history. This is what I guess I meant about creative nonfiction lets you write about things that aren't related to each other, but they're related in my mind. And so I wrote about, thinking about Odin and sacrifice and violence and rural Texas, then led to a vignette where I reconstruct a lynching that had taken place in Texan history. That was just an absolutely horrific story because a young girl, the daughter of a local deputy sheriff, she's about 4 years old, her name was Myrtle Vance. This is in the late 19th century. She was found brutally raped and murdered. And then the story just gets worse because a man, an African-American man, who her father had beaten up a few days earlier, was immediately accused of the crime, and then he's tortured and lynched horribly. So it was just a terrible story, and on many levels. And then it made me think about, another vignette, issues of kidnappings in even earlier Texan history and interactions between settlers and the Comanche. So I did a lot of kind of research for it. I used a lot of memoirs and newspaper articles. So I guess it was ideas about violence and also the restorative power of writing that it was the link that tied everything together. So it's called the Ashtray, and I'm thinking about Odin's ashtray.
Very good. Sounds like a fascinating essay.
Thank you.
And you know, we forget sometimes as Americans that, you know, from a historical perspective, as Manifest Destiny, as we went westward, that, you know, all those shows like Bonanza, and the shows we watch on TV, that, I mean, although fictionalized, it gives you an idea of what the West was like at that time, and it was kind of a lawless, violent, sort of untamed environment for a long time, and we tend to forget that today. But looking back, it's interesting that kind of some of that gets reflected in your essay. So that's really good.
Absolutely. I always felt bad because I think that so those incidents took place in Lamar County. And I had stayed for several years with a friend of mine in a little town called Roxton, Texas. And I always felt bad because I think they saw the essay maybe as a criticism, when really, in some ways, it was kind of a love letter, because being there, I became so immersed in the history that I wanted to just learn more and more about it.
Yeah, very good. I mean, it sounds like a fantastic essay, and,
Thank you.
On an very interesting topic. So, in our closing moments, Laura Michele, what are you working on next? What's the next project you've got in the works or down the pipeline, or what is it that you're thinking about working on next?
Oh, I have actually finished an essay, and I've sent it out to 1 million places. So wish me luck. And it's about conversion narratives. I look at a few women, in particular Edith Stein, who was a Jewish woman. She was born in the 1890s in what is now Poland, but then was Germany, and she ended up converting to Catholicism as an adult. She was actually a fairly famous philosopher, and then became a Carmelite nun. But she was in Germany, the war broke out, and she ended up dying at Auschwitz. So I look at her, I look at Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic who was born Catholic, but actually was her grandfather was born Jewish, and this was sort of the period of forced conversions. So she was very conscious of that heritage. And I look at the narrative of Ruth, who was a convert in the Bible, and kind of draw them all together.
That sounds fascinating.
Thank you.
And Ruth is one of those, you know, Bible stories wise, you know, a book of the Bible that's not studied a lot or not preached about. You know, there's a lot of, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John preached, a lot of the early Old Testament, but, you know, books like Ruth and Amos and Malachi don't get preached on, but there's great characters in there that are worth looking at.
There really are, and amazing stories. So to write the essay, I went back to my childhood, where I had some pretty serious biblical training.
Very good. Sounds like a fantastic essay, and we wish you luck in finding that a home. So
thank you.
So in our final moments, Laura Michele, with you today, if anyone on our program, watching our program, wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your writing, about your career as a historian, or just to get in touch with you in any way, how can they get in contact with you, and maybe where are some places they could find your essays?
Okay, great. Well, all my contact information is available through Marshall University. We have a website, and I know my email is on multiple places, on the Women's Studies website, on the History website. Also, a few of the essays that we discussed, the one about my father, and a few others are online at a wonderful magazine that is no longer it's no longer publishing, but everything's archived online, Numero Sank. And so you just Google Numero Sank, and there you go. That essay about the Kentucky nuns is online at Yes Magazine. So you can just Google that. But yes, I'm happy to talk to anybody about writing.
Great, sounds great. Laura Michele Diener has been our guest today here on Chapters. We've been talking to her about her career as a writer and an essayist, and talking about some of her essays here on the program today. Laura Michelle, it was a delight to have you on. Thank you for coming on the program to talk with us, and we wish you all the best as you keep writing essays and sending them out for publication. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News to satisfy any reading taste you have, and also remind you that many of the author, editor, and publishers we've had featured on our Chapters program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down and talk to the staff here at Pullman Square, and they can get you taken care of with whatever kind of reading you're looking for right here at Empire Books and News. And we appreciate their sponsorship of our program each and every taping here on Chapters. And we'd love to hear from you. One of the best parts of our program is hearing from our viewers, and we've made a variety of different ways for you to do that via social media. One of the first ways to do that is through our email address, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. We do ask that you please send us your name and the town or community in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. Also, if you like to watch programs on YouTube, we have a Chapters page through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. All you've got to do is put that into your search browser, click on the Chapters tab, and we've got all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And we're even on Facebook. Chapters has a Facebook page, and that address is here at the bottom of the screen. What you'll find on the Facebook page is our more recent author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. But you can interact with viewers of the program, like the interviews that you see, share them to your Facebook page or any other writing and reading related pages you might be a part of, and get those interviews out and get that conversation going. And so we know many of you stayed in contact with us through one of those social media platforms, and we really appreciate all the feedback and comments that we do receive about the program. So please keep your thoughts and comments coming. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please join us next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.